I'd like to introduce what I have to say with a few words from Swami Vivekananda. And since these are such difficult times we're living in, it's, I think, apropos. This is from some statements he made in New York City around 1896. The first one is about something that his master Ramakrishna said. My master used to say, "This world is a vast lunatic asylum where all men are mad, some after money, some after women, and some after name or fame, and a few after God. I prefer to be mad after God. God is the philosopher's stone that turns us into gold in an instant. The form remains, but the nature is changed. The human form remains, but no more can we hurt or sin." And then later he says, "When the sun of love begins to break on the horizon, we want to give up all our actions unto God. And when we forget him for a moment, it grieves us greatly."
Wow.
As Kathy mentioned, I come from an Irish background and an Irish Catholic family. And as a little boy, even although I must say that there was no serious or hysterical focus on religion in my family, from hearing what I did about the life of Christ, as a little boy at school, it would sometimes get me into trouble because I would daydream, and mind you, I was 6 or 7 years old. I would daydream that, looking out the window, that one day I would physically meet Jesus Christ. And then the teacher, this was a one-room schoolhouse about 8 miles out of Woodstock, New York, would say, "Thomas, why are you daydreaming again? Go in the corner." And then tell a little bit about the high school introduction. This is funny. In my senior year at high school, all the boys were called up for a pre-induction physical in Albany, New York, which was about, say, 45 or 50 miles from Kingston, New York, where I went to high school, for the Korean War. And we all got into buses, drove all the way up to Albany to an immense medical facility. And as soon as we were brought into this place, we were ordered to immediately take off all of our clothes, everything. Humiliating, especially humiliating because there were young student nurses walking this way and that way through the crowd. So it was humiliating, difficult situation. But anyway, it took a long time, and we went through all the various tests. And here I was at the desk of maybe a captain or a colonel or something like this, who had all of my reports and was ready to stamp accepted. And he said to me just casually, "How do you feel about going into the Army, Tom?" And I said, "Well, I'm not looking forward to it at all. Something that I don't like." And he looked at me with an alarmed look and said, "Have you seen the psychiatrist, Tom?" I said, "No, I haven't." He said, "Well, you see those boys in front of those big oak doors? You go over and get in line over there. which in turn, see what Dr. Phillips has to say. So I went over and waited. And finally, my turn came and I went in. And honestly, this is the way it was. It's an enormous room with bookshelves and a desk, and sitting behind the desk, Sigmund Freud, just like it, with a double-breasted suit. What? And he was also naked.
Good.
So I began to...
Still naked.
Still totally naked. Stitch of clothing. The seat was still warm from a very overweight boy who was just coming out as I was going in. And while I'm sitting there, nurses are coming in with papers and handy. So he starts off his inquisition, trying to find out where I'm coming from. And questions like, how do you feel about girls? I said, I don't like them. I have friends with girls. So, finally, as I remember, it came to somehow Jesus Christ got into the picture. And I began, because by this time, I was convinced, for no specific or definite reason, I was convinced, still convinced, that one day I was going to meet Jesus Christ. How that would happen, I didn't know. It was a mystery even to me. So somehow this leaked out, and his eyes got big. His eyes got really big, and he got serious and got his pad and the pencil, and everything I said he was quickly jotting down. What would he look like? Well, I wasn't quite sure. He might look like the conventional pictures of Jesus that you see now. I'm not sure. What would he be wearing? Would he be wearing a garment, or would he be dressed like me? How could I answer these questions? I did the best I could, and every answer I gave, he quickly write down. It might be New York City, might be. And finally, after this went on for quite some time, he says, "Oh, thanks very much, Tom. You check with your draft board in a couple of weeks and see how you stand with all this." About 2 weeks later, I went to the draft board. And the fellow behind the counter said, hold on just a minute. He went back into some filing cabinets and came out with a card. And he said, wow, they're not going to be calling you Tom. I said, why not? He handed me the card and it said, schizoid personality. And then in parentheses, here. So that was the end of that. I never heard of it. It's interesting because there were two very good friends of mine who were killed in Korea. With my let's see. 5 years or so passed, and I had completed my work at college, Fine Arts College at Temple University outside of Philadelphia, and I was back in Woodstock. And in Woodstock, I put an ad in the paper that I was available for part-time work. I had a studio. And someone responded to the ad. There was a man with an accent. Turned out that he needed help because he was selling his father's home. Now, he was a Hungarian, the man called. And his father had immigrated to this country right after the First World War. He had been the head of the Paris Conservatory of Music. And his son, Raoul Vidas was his name, his son had been a child prodigy. So they came to America, and he found work at the Juilliard School in New York City, and built a beautiful big craftsman home up in Woodstock, and every summer they would go there, and he would also teach in this big house. So now the father had passed away about 10 years before, and Raoul and his mother, who was with him, were living in California. And so he was selling the house. Raoul wrote movie music in Hollywood. He was a man probably around 50 or so, 52. And my work was to pack things up so that when the movers came, the boxes would be all ready. And one of the jobs I had was putting books in special boxes out of the rather large library. So I would take several books at a time, make a stack and fill in the box and send one stack. As I put it in the box, there was the most remarkable face. This face was on the cover of a biographical sketch of Meher Baba's life and about his, what he had to say about life and his message. And this was this wonderful face was that book. So as soon as I saw that face, it was remarkable to me, and I recognized something. And you remember that Baba said that in each of his incarnations, he somewhat resembles himself, and so that when people come across him again, this happens, and you recognize something. And I asked Raoul, who is this man? Because at this point, because I remember in my sophomore year at college, a wonderful guy, he and his wife were theosophists, and he had been in the Korean War. He was, I would say 19, he was 27. And he was getting a fine arts degree. But anyway, he was very interested in Ramakrishna. So he gave me an abridged version of the Gospel of Ramakrishna, which meant everything to me. And later I read the whole Gospel, more than once. So I was anxious to hear more about it. So he told me that he had met Meher Baba in Hollywood. He was about 26 years old, 1932. And he was invited, he happened to meet Meher Baba because he was invited to Pickfair by Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks Sr. They were having a reception for Meher Baba. He was one of the guests. So he went, and as it turned out, Meher Baba seems to have liked him quite a bit, because he asked him to join a group of people who were going on a motor tour. And he went on the tour, and they spent overnight at a cabin colony. And after dinner, one of Baba's Mandalis came, knocked on his door, and said, "I have a message for you from Meher Baba." So he came in and he said, "Meher Baba would be pleased if you could join him in India for a specific length of time. But there are two conditions to this opportunity. One is that you have to entirely stop smoking, almost. And the second one is you have to give up your involvement with women entirely. So Baba wants you to think about this and in the morning before breakfast, I'll come over. You can tell me what you decide. So the next morning, he pondered the whole thing, and the next morning, the Mandali came over, and he said to him, I'll be glad to stop smoking, but I can't give up my involvement with smoking. So, and he told me then that I was naive. What did I know? I missed such an opportunity, but that's the way it had to be. See, is there anything else to talk about? Well, wonderful man. Some time passed, and I think it was the next year, or it was 55. And every summer, during my years at college, every summer I went to sea, usually for, say, a maximum of 3 months, as an ordinary seaman on freighters. And usually we would go into the Mediterranean or down to South America. But this time we had come back from the Mediterranean and made we had some time in New York City, and we docked in New Jersey, and I went over to New York and went to a place, a famous bookshop called Weiser's Bookstore. And in the basement of Weiser's Bookstore was an occult and esoteric and philosophical section. I went down into that section, down the steps, and right ahead of me on a post was a poster of Meher Baba with a recent photograph, so that I didn't at once recognize him from this photograph I showed you. And it said, just off the press, God Speaks by Meher Baba. So I immediately bought the book, and took it back aboard the ship, and during that short voyage down, maybe 3 weeks or so, I read God Speaks. I think I might have even read it twice. That was a revelation to me, because it resolved and answered so many important questions I had about the New Testament, even the Old Testament, and a view of life that was really important and deeply meaningful to me. So that I began to, you'll have to bear with me, the dates and the times are getting a little vague to me. But here I am, and I have a little apartment in Greenwich Village because the school I was attending was there in the village. It's called the New School. And I was in communication with Adi Irani. And every time I would write to Adi, he would respond right away. So we had this communication going back and forth. Now, I had a friend in Woodstock who was a Jewish girl, a little bit older than myself, and she was going with a friend of mine. Esther Gilman was her name, and Esther was a student at the Art Students League in Woodstock, studying painting. Now, Esther was in conflict about something very important. She and her husband were separated. Her husband, Richard, was a journalist with the New York Times, and he was a book critic and a film critic. And often I would see and read his articles in the paper about a book that he's come out, or about a play on Broadway, or a new theatrical production. And it turns out that Esther's husband had met a French priest, a Catholic priest, who was a very close friend of Thomas Merton, the important writer like Thomas Merton, an advanced soul. And he had been converted, even though he was Jewish, he had been converted to Catholicism. And Esther was in conflict about this whole matter. Now, here I was in New York. I'd been in part of the summer up in Woodstock. And here I was in New York. And I'm walking one day through Washington Square, this beautiful square in the heart of the village. And who's walking toward me but Esther and her husband, Richard. So they was, happy to see me and invited me to dinner a couple of days later. They lived in a posh, beautiful place up on Fifth Avenue near the Metropolitan Museum. So I went to dinner, and here was the French priest and various people, and the conversation turned around religion and art, and they were conscious people, and nobody put anything coercive on me or anything like that. But I myself was in conflict about Catholicism, because since an early age, the whole idea of religious formality was upsetting to me. It was actually acted as a barrier to me, to get at what I couldn't articulate then, but what really was the divine beloved within, waiting to be awakened, something like that. So I was communicating about this very thing to Adi Rami. And a couple of weeks later, a letter comes from Adi, and he says, I had the opportunity to read your letter to Meher Baba, and he wishes you to understand the following. Stay away from all religious forms, structures, and ceremonies, and religious shows of any kind will not be good. So this was an immense relief. That was the end of that. It's like a let out of prison. Well, this was a great thing. What kind of liberation. Okay.
Right now.
Well, you're at that park.
I'm at the apartment. So I'm at the new school. I'm studying. One of the things I'm studying there is Indian philosophy with an Indian named Sabod Chandra Roy. He's totally blind and a wonderful person. And it turned out he was a friend of Adele Walton. No, Adele. Now, also, I found out maybe 6 or 7 months ago, what is that Indian doctor's name at Myrtle Beach?
No, Dr. Morty.
Dr. Morty. Yes, Dr. Morty. I happened to mention this Indian, Sabod Chandra Roy, to him, and he was astounded because Sabod Chandra Roy was his father's closest friend. Isn't that amazing? And he knew him very well also. Now, through a telephone call to Adele Walton, I had not yet met her, I got the name of Fred and Ella Winterfeld in New York because they headed up a group of people interested in Meher Baba and devoted to Meher Baba. So I went over one day. Fred was the manager of a very posh apartment house on the east side of New York, Manhattan House it was called. And actually, in a penthouse in one of these beautiful apartments, Norina Machiavelli lived. And Fred had to go up there one day in response to something that she needed, and he had to look at it. And above the fireplace in the living room was a niche. And in the niche was a sculpture of the Buddha. And Fred and Ella were Buddhists. And this was exciting to him. And they began to talk, and he noticed that around the room there were pictures of this individual. And within a short time, he found out about Meher Baba. And shortly thereafter, both he and Ella had found what they'd always been looking for. So I came to Fred's apartment and went up and rang the bell, and the little voice came, "Who is it?" So I said, "My name is Tom Langer, and I've come to find out more about Meher Baba." And I heard him say, "Morning, someone's here to find out more about Meher Baba." Hitting the door. And I went up. They were both, when I arrived, absolutely radiant. See, and Fred was especially ecstatic. And she said, Ella said, "You'll have to forgive Fred, because about 10 days ago, our beautiful Persian cat was killed. And Fred was in the bedroom this morning, and walking out of the closet across the room was the cat, and it disappeared into the far wall. And as it passed by, it looked at Fred and said, 'I'm fine, Dad.'" Fred was in heaven. He came at just the right time. We became really good friends. And so, this was essentially how I learned all about Meher Baba. And then I attended their Monday night meetings. And
You just missed. That was in 56. You just missed.
yeah, in 57 I married.
But Tom just thought it had just come.
Oh, yes, and they told me, what a shame. 3 weeks ago, Baba was here. This was 56.
Please become. How do you think it was that you didn't get that information from Artie? That Baba
No, I think I'd say my timing was a little off. I think the conversation, the communications with Artie were immediately after. Yeah, that's how it was. And yeah, time passed, and I married in 57. And beginning of 57. And in 58, let's see, we had a little girl, Christine, some of you may know her, I've met her. And I have a son, Damien, now, who lives in Myrtle Beach. We moved back to Woodstock, New York, and we lived in the old artists' quarters of Woodstock. It was known as the Martyr. It was founded about 1905, 1906. And it was very primitive living. And this appealed to us very much, because at that time we thought this was the right way to live. No running water, no electricity, just a well, wood stove, outhouse. So we lived like that wonderfully for a couple of years. And then the word came that Baba was going to have a gathering, a big gathering here in 1962.
58.
I'm sorry. Yep. So we left the center. At that time, everybody went by bus. There was no airport. Everybody went by bus. And no one at that time was allowed to stay on the center. So everyone, except for Mandali, stayed in motels.
I'll talk a little bit about it.
So my first introduction to Meher Baba took place in the Lagoon Cabin. There were, I think, 19 people who were present there who had not yet met Meher Baba. And these people were invited into the kind of crammed into the Lagoon Cabin. And I was one of the last people in. I remember Meher Baba looking around, smiling, just as I came in, and asked Nariman, who is this? So I introduced myself.
And Tom,
Oh yeah, he couldn't quite hear me, so a couple of times I had to say my name. But, you know, I'm glad I had that special little energy. So there were no fireworks, there was nothing really uniquely overwhelming about that meeting. And then later that afternoon, my wife Yvonne and I were invited to have a formal and private meeting with Meherabad. And again, we went into the lagoon cabinet. It's the most natural thing to, without even thinking about it, just to walk over to Baba's chair and kneel down in front of him. And he asked if we had any questions. And then he looked at me, and I remember saying to him, Baba, there are such barriers between you and me. And he looked seriously into my eyes. And by that, I meant that there was a reality in him, and also a reality in me, and I was not connecting with that reality. It was like a mountain, and something's on the other side, and you have to get to it, and it's hard to climb up over the mountain, something like that. And he shook his head knowingly. And then he communicated with Yvonne. And as we were leaving, I was thinking, thought was going through my mind. I said to myself, how could he possibly help?
Tom, those two questions are out exactly.
No, yeah. I said, how could he possibly help me? And as that thought came into my head, Nariman was interpreting some gestures that Baba was making. And he looked right at me, and Nariman said, don't worry, I will help you. And later I'll tell you about how Baba, the words were not even necessary. It's amazing how he could talk right into your head without saying, just like I'm talking. So then I'd say another day or two passed, and I was standing in those days on the center, all the interior roads around the inner part of the center were lined with big peeled pine logs like this, so you could sit on them. And time went by and the logs began to decay, so we took them all away. It was quite beautiful to look at. And so the people clustered, all of the people, I would say there were about 350 people on the center. They would cluster around the lagoon cabin. In the morning, Baba would discourse in the barn. And then after lunch, he would always be in the lagoon cabin. And as I say, people would congregate around the lagoon cabin, not next to the cabin, but on the road, on the other side of the road. There was people sitting on those logs. And I was with a friend, Leatrice Shaw, who was seated in front of the main door on the log, on the railing, on that log. And I was in front of her and we were talking. And all of a sudden, from behind some bushes and little trees, Margaret Trask appeared and said, looked around and said, Meher Baba wants to see Tom Riley now. That's right in the middle of the sentence. I abandoned the went over to where Margaret was, to the side entrance that faces the lake. The little steps go up to that door. She disappeared. And I went over to the steps and took off my sneakers. And as I was about to go up the steps, I felt this holiness, sacredness, coming on me. It was a strange thing, and as the sacredness came, my impression of, the world around me began to alter. And as I went up the steps, that holiness became really sacred. And I saw that my hands were like this, and I opened the door and went in. And Baba was seated in that same chair that's there now, although the chair was now in the middle of the room. There was no couch there then or anything like that. It was just essentially an empty room. And he was, it's hard to describe, but he was absolutely radiating. And light was coming out of him. And his light was, see, what he did, it wasn't that I was seeing this. He had altered something inside of myself to be able to have a deeper insight into who he is, something like that. And as I say, these rays were coming out of him, very, very subtle, and pervaded that whole space. So that sacredness was absolutely everywhere. And he was so happy to see me. He was just, and his eyes were glistening, and he was beside himself with happiness at seeing me. And he held out his hand to me like this. And there was absolutely nothing to say. But all I could do was walk over to him, and I took his hand, and kissed his hand, and went out the other door. And as I looked back, he was still in that ecstatic state. He was in a wholly different region. And as I went out, people were coming over to me and asking me what happened in there, and touching me, and I couldn't focus on them at all. I kept walking, and I walked all the way down to the beach, and I must have walked for over an hour. And when I came back to the center, to the middle of where we were going cabin, Baba was outside instructing his men in the most energetic and specific way. Want them there at 3:30, you go over there, do this, you do that, he's right back here in this plane. One morning in the barn, I think it was the last morning of the Sahaba. And Meher Baba asked Harry Kenmore, he told everyone there that Harry Kenmore from New York was going to recite the Master's prayer, and that everyone should stand, including Meher Baba. Everyone stood, and Harry began very dramatically to recite the prayer. Oh, pardon, God, if anybody's ever heard Harry, pure theater, and almost Shakespearean. So Harry recited, and as he was doing this, Meher Baba was standing. His eyes were glistening, and his whole body was in movement. And not only that, but his glance was everywhere at once. I don't think there was a set of eyes that he missed in that whole gathering of those hundreds of people. And his hands were in, his whole body was in motion like this. And I felt something rising up in my chest, and I thought I'd just simply die with what was transforming and happening there. And finally, it ended, and I survived. So, Baba then said, everyone, the place will be divided in half. This half, by the main entrance, will leave quietly first. And then after that, the second half will orderly, quietly move out. So I was in the second half. And as we were moving forward, all of a sudden, right in front of me, Baba was sitting in his chair. I just happened to be there. And the movement of the whole crowd forced me to be right in front of him. He was sitting in the chair, looking with the most intense look, like my life, his life, the whole world depended on the outcome of this look. And it was absolutely overwhelming to me. And then all of a sudden he went like this. Well, that work is done. Now it's my turn to go also. So he went to get up like this, and I thought, I've got to get outside. I've got to find a good place so I can be right next to the, the steps or the path. When he comes by, I can be right there. And as I got to the door and looked back, he was doing the same thing as somebody else. Well, here I am back at Woodstock again. And time passed, and in the circle of artists and writers that I moved in, it was, it would be peculiar and odd if somebody didn't smoke a little hash. So, I was a hash smoker. And I smoked hash because it brought me right there to that sacredness. And this went on for, let's say, 58 to almost 62. And then the word came that there was going to be a great gathering in India. And I prepared myself to do that. And in order to get there, since I had valid Siemens papers, I was going to take a passage on an Italian liner going to Gibraltar. The Saturnia was the name of that liner. It was a big passenger liner. And so I went to New York to book the passage on this liner. This was probably 4 or 5 weeks before anybody else left on a chartered flight. So I went to New York, and Adele Walton heard that I was coming to New York and said, please, I'd love you to come for lunch. So I went to her apartment to have lunch. And after this very pleasant lunch, just casually and innocently, I asked her if she'd like to smoke a little hash. Oh, no, Tom, no, not right now. And I said, she's right. It's the middle of the day, and she's got to delight. So this was, in a way, a blessing, because what did she do? But she immediately, after I left by Tom, she immediately went and typed a letter to Dr. Goher. This is going on. This is what's happening. So, but one of the things that I should tell you about this, about the Russians, yeah. She, there was a man, a wonderful man named Warren Healy. And Warren Healy was a printer who did all the printing for the Awakener magazine. And Adele had asked him if he would kindly print some little booklet about Meher Baba in Russian, and which he did. She had it wasn't very big, it was a box like this, filled with a variety of little bound booklets. And she said to me, Tom, this may sound odd to you, but I have a distinct feeling that you're going to meet some Russians on your way. And that's why I'm giving you this. Would you please take this? And if you find the Russians, give them these books.
Yeah.
Russian. Okay. Because, see, my object was to go to Gibraltar, and from Gibraltar, try to find the ship that was going to India. Anyway, here I was in Gibraltar, and I met a Scotsman, a wonderful guy, a real comic link. He was had been backpacking all over Europe. Here he was in Gibraltar. So we found quarters. It was only 50 cents a night at one of these religious hospitals. And so it so happened that I met an elderly Englishman who wanted to sell his 1946 Austin car. Beautiful looking car. Guess how much? $50 for the car. So I went to the Mobil Oil Company there in Gibraltar with the idea in mind, I can drive all the way to it. No. I don't want to take a ship. So they mapped out the whole thing for me, all the way here, all the way down to Afghanistan, and right down the city. Before you know it, you're going to be in Bombay. Great. Absolutely great. All the stations were there, and the whole thing was rooted out. I just can't be any problem at all. That's what I wanted to do. So I drove up into Spain, and I'm coming up to, I think, Marbella. And beautiful, wonderful little city overlooking the sea. And all the time that I'm driving, the radiator is leaking, getting worse, and I'm putting stop leak in and trying to stop the leaking. But I'm really beginning to get tired of filling it up with water. But anyway, I stopped and asked someone if they knew of a pension, place where I could spend the night. And they said, oh yes, there are some people, elderly people, who live up on that ridge. And up on the ridge was some beautiful villas up there. And they'll put you up, and it's a bed and breakfast. They'll put you up, and you like them. They're wonderful people. So I drove up and knocked at the door.
You stop just a second. Sorry, my dad was confused.
The woman came to the door with a Russian accent. What can I do for you? I told her, I'm on my way, up to Barcelona, and I need a place for the night. And she questioned me and talked to me. She and I talked for a while, and I told her I was from America, and I happened to mention to her that I had studied Russian literature at the new school with a Russian, evidently who had met Leo Tolstoy. And her eyes got big. And she goes to a door off the kitchen and she says, Alexei, come quickly. There's someone, who knows Elias Contact. So Alexei comes in, he's excited also. So we meet. They're absolutely wonderful people. And we talk all about Elias Tartak and about Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. It turned out something I didn't know, that Elias, amongst all the white Russians, because these were white Russians, and as it turned out, there in Marbella was a whole colony of white Russians. The whole colony of them, all mostly elderly, who had gotten out of Russia just before the revolution with their mothers. And these were old aristocrats. And they told me about Elias, that amongst the Russian communities all over the Western world, outside of Russia, outside of the Soviet Union, he was heroic. And something I didn't even know about him, because in the late 20s into the 30s, Elias, with the help of wealthy Russians, went back into Russia to get intellectuals, scientists, and artists out of the country. And Elias met, like I say, he met Tolstoy when he was 17 years old. And it happened like this. I'll just tell that quickly because it's important. There was a wealthy count who had 4,000 or 5,000 acres of land. And he was devoted to Leo Tolstoy and implemented and established onto the state school for the peasant children. This is what Tolstoy wanted. He had a wonderful system of education. And Elias was one of these peasant children. And he excelled in such a way, one of the children that excelled in such a way that they sent him to college at McGill University in Canada. And he completed his course there, and after that he got a doctorate at Harvard, and then he taught at Columbia University. He also taught at the new school, and that's how I met him. So that was Reliance Hardback. And then they began to ask me about what I was doing, where I was going, and I thought, oh, God, the booklets. So I got the booklets out of the car, and I said, this was after dinner, it was getting late, and I said, told them about Adele, and I said, this is something you might like to look at. And because I could see that, you know, Russians have an esoteric side, and these people were interested, and you know, we're interested in Meher Baba. So I thought, well, this is it. So I gave them the booklets and we went to bed. And the next morning, with my wife, I forget what her name was, but she came out with tears in her eyes. She said, and then Alexei came out also with tears. He says, you have no idea what you've done for us. This is an answer to our prayer. We can see what a wonderful person Meher Baba is. This is such a wonderful, this went on like this. So, that is what Adele had. How did she know? How did she possibly know? So then when I was leaving, oh, they were so sorry to see me go. I remember Alexei said to me, goodbye, beloved, and God bless you. Keep you safe and your sacred pilgrimage. We were both like this. Amazing. So the car got worse and worse. Finally, here I was at Barcelona, and it was just gave out. So I was at a repair station, and the owner's brother that evening, that afternoon, was driving to Madrid. And he would take me all the way to Madrid because it was an overnight trip. I liked them, and I decided I'm going to go to Madrid and take the plane. So I just gave him the offer because it would have taken 2 to 3 weeks to get a new radio. So I gave him the offer. And they drove me all the way to the airport at no cost to me. Spent the night at his sister's. And the next day I got on the plane and flew off to Bombay. And here it was about 7 o'clock in the morning. Another odd story coming up. 7 o'clock, and on the way I had made friends with an Indian businessman. We talked about a number of things. The plane came in, landed, the doors opened, and the aromas of India came in to the plane. And tears just came out because it brought back memories from the past. I remember clearly hearing within myself, I'm home again. That kind of experience. It brought it all together. So we're going down the steps. And at that time, Bombay Airport was just dirt paths. There was no concrete, nothing fancy, and overgrown lawns, and little signs here and there along the path. Stay on the paths. Snakes are present. I turned to the businessman and I said, what does that mean, snakes are present? He said, what kind of snake? Oh, sir, these are little cobras about this big. And do what they tell you because an Englishman was wandered off to get something.
one of them bit him on the ankle and he didn't even make it to the hospital. That was only 10 days ago. So mind that you do what it says. Don't go off the path. So we're all heading toward this, what looked like a kind of a Quonset hut. So all the people were lining up. And I turned to him and I said, why are the people lining up here? Lining up, they're taking the visas. Visa? Totally neglected. Permanently up at Woodstock. The idea of visa never occurred to me at all. Oh, isn't that amazing? And I thought, oh my God, and as I approached the Quonset hut, I could see that there was an individual, a very angry man. A khaki-colored uniform with little food spots. And behind him was a much younger man, looking upset and worried, because this man, everybody who came to him, he was somebody from Sweden, he was somebody from England, somebody from France, he was abusing everyone, and disrespectful and abusing. And the young man was all upset because he wished he could do something about it, but he was helpless, because this was, his superior. So my turn came, and there I was in front of him. What are you standing there for? Why are you looking at me like that? Give me the visa. So I said, I have no visa. He went completely bananas. That's crazy. All he said to me was, go and sit down and get ready to take the next plane home. Next, you, give it to me. So I'm sitting there like this, and I'm devastated. I say to myself, you fool, look what you've done to yourself, like this. And I'm looking, and the young man is looking like and checking out, his superior. He makes his way around like this, and he comes over to me and he says, I see you have a serious problem right now. I'd like to help you any way I can. And he's watching like this one. I don't know what it's like. He needs somebody else. It's terrible time. And he says, I think I know the way that you can get some help. You see that young girl over there in the blue sari? She works for Air India, and it's her duty to help people in distress. Shall I go and see if she can be of some help? I said, please get her immediately. So he went over and got her, and she came over. She, it turned out, was an Indian Christian from Goa. She was only 19 years old. And she sized up the situation right away. And her whole impulse was, I've got to do something here. I've got to do something positive. Servitude. This was it. She was the example of that. And she talked a bit, and she says, I have an idea. I think this is the way to handle it. You've got to go see the chief commissioner of immigration and customs. If that was right. Something he was big. And he's in Bombay. She said, I'm going to talk to the superior over here now. So she walks over to him and waits a bit while he's abusing someone. And just the right moment, she touches him like this. What do you want? He turns on her like this. And she put a vibe on him. A smile and everything by touching and putting out an energy that within, I say, a couple of minutes, he was, yeah, well, that's right. Yes, so she charmed. All of a sudden, from like a demon, he turned into a lamb. She had complete power. So, all of a sudden, who shows up but the girl's fiance? Wonderful guy. we became instant friends, and they invited me to her parents' house, where I had a wonderful dinner.
Tell what you said. Official said you could stay overnight.
Hmm?
You could stay overnight.
You could stay overnight in the next, gave you, say, what did he say?
Oh, yeah, well, the whole idea was that I could stay and go and see the commissioner, just what she wanted. He acquiesced in whatever she wanted, naturally, with that power. So they found right nearby a little place for me to stay for the night. And the very next morning when I got up, there was a taxi waiting, who took me right into the city to a gigantic, big stone municipal building. And up on the second floor was this vast room. People were already there. It must have been 7 o'clock in the morning. And there was a receptionist, and I put my name down and waited. And over here were 2 great big wooden doors. And inside was the commissioner. And just before me were 2 young English backpackers. And they went in, the door was almost closed, and the talking got louder and louder, and all of a sudden I heard a fist come down on the table, and I heard the word, "No." Yes. And they came out with their heads hanging down and left. And I thought, I don't have a chance. This is the end. I'll be on the plane this afternoon. So I went in, they closed the door, and this man, a man of about, I'd say, he looked to me about 45, 47, sitting at the desk, looking down and writing. I walked over to the front of the desk, and I waited there for a long time before he looked up at me. And I thought to myself, he's had it with the young Westerners, and I'm one of them. I'm going to get the same no. So all of a sudden he looked up and very calmly said, what is it you want? And my heart was so filled up with this crisis and the potential of grief over the potential disaster of having to go home, that the only thing that mattered to me was Meherabad's love, and Meherabad's health, and my love for Meherabad. And this must have been communicating itself to him. And I told him all about my need to go to Pune and be with Meherabad. And if nothing else was more important, this was the only thing in my life at this juncture that mattered. Nothing else but that. And this communicated itself to him because he looked at me and said, I'm going to extend you a visa for 30 days. And if you need it for any further length of time, get in touch with me. He handed me his card. He said, and for no matter how much time you need, for what length of time you need, I will give it to you. And so I said to him, I have no words to thank you for what you've just done for me. And he stood up and bowed his head and put his hands together like this and said, no, I must thank you. Amazing. It's sacred. Yeah. Because this man seized an opportunity to serve. Wow. He's got a special place in my heart. I hope I can return his favor once. Yeah, that was so sacred. And then the next morning, I phoned Meherji. I phoned Meherji, and took the, no, that afternoon I phoned Meherji, and the next day I took the Deccan Queen out of Bombay to Pune. And Meherji was waiting for me at the railway station. Took me to the Pune Hotel. Wonderful place. It's such a shame they tore down that beautiful hotel. And there's hardly anybody there because it was about 10 or 12 days before anyone else arrived. So here I was, and because the hotel was virtually empty, they gave me a beautiful suite in the back of the hotel with a big, beautiful bathroom and a little writing room and open space, a little niche with a bed and everything. It was just spacious and beautiful. And I settled in there, and I had brought with me the poems of Kabir, and of Hafiz and Rumi, Sadi, and I established a routine for myself that every morning I would have breakfast, and immediately after I would walk out in a different direction to the city. And the city has so much changed since then. Those beautiful mansions next to Guru Prasad, and Guru Prasad itself gone. It was such a pleasure just to look at all that wonderful architecture. But anyway, it must have been about the third day or so. As I say, as I came back from my walk, because it began to get extremely hot. So I came back from the walk, and I would have lunch and shower, and I would lie in bed and read. I also had Aldous Huxley with me, Heaven and Hell and the Gates of Perception. And I was reading this time a poem of Hafiz when someone knocked at the door. And I said whoever it was to come in. And it was somebody I'd never seen before. It turned out to be Francis Rabbaton. And Francis simply introduced himself and said, Meher Baba wants to see you right now. So I immediately got myself ready. And I have to say that being there in such close proximity to Baba and reading the odes of Hafiz, I was in such a state of love and grief and anguish that it's not easy to describe. But anyway, in this state, and also the imminence of soon being with Meherabad, we left together, and outside waiting was an automobile with a young man in the driver's seat. So Francis and I got in the back. And as we left and were driving, what was the distance, maybe 3/4 of a mile or so, to Guru Prasad, everything was surreal to me. A bit like going into the lagoon cabin and having consciousness altered. It was sort of like that, going toward Meherabad. With this anguish and this indescribable grief, that I was holding myself together with all the strength I had to prevent myself from just bursting into tears. And it was a strain to hold myself together like this. And all of a sudden, next to me, I heard like this. And I turned, tears streaming down Francis's face. I thought, isn't that amazing? That oneness that he understands and he's experiencing my state of despair and grief. Finally, we went through the gates and the gardens around to the steps leading up to the veranda. And the car stopped, and the young man got out and disappeared up the steps. Francis came around and said, don't forget to remove your shoes. And he disappeared. And as I stepped out of the car, it was like a benediction. The sacredness came all over me. And I must tell you, I became a holy man. That's all I can, it's the only way I can explain it, because my hands were folded like this. And, you know, that sacred, holy poise was all around me. And in that state, I made my way up the steps, and I was surprised again to see my hands, but realized that my hands were like this. When I got to the top, to my left, as I got to the top, these gigantic doors opening into what was called the Mandali Hall, which was a structure projecting out of Guru Prasad. And this is the place where Baba met with his Mandali. As I got to the top and looked over, I was vaguely aware of men sitting on carpets. And as I looked, Meher Baba was sitting at a simple chair, and he was beside himself, almost, just couldn't almost moving, winking. He was so happy to see me. He was just so thrilled to see me, and his eyes were just like shining silver, just gleaming. And I walked over to him, and all of a sudden, from that state of poise, sacredness, an avalanche of grief came over me, and I fell down and knelt down in front of him and put my head on his lap. And I felt him caressing my head, and I heard a moaning or a groaning sound, like a humming, groaning sound that he was making. Like in every way, in the deepest sense, he was identifying and empathizing with that state that I was in, that comes from how many lifetimes. And then all of a sudden I looked and saw under the hem of his little thin jacket some very lacy work that had been lovingly crocheted or knitted by one of his lovers. And I looked at that detail, and that refinement brought me back to the moment. All of a sudden, I knew that I had to sit down in front of the men on those oriental carpets. Baba was here about 7 or 8 feet away. Next to him standing was Eric. So, first thing, he asked me all about myself, who I was, who did I know in New York. I mentioned a variety of people, and said, what of my work have you read? I said, Baba, I think I've read almost everything that's been printed in English. That's come from you. And he said, maybe leaving something out, but he said, have you read God Speak? Have you read God Speak? And I said, yes, Baba, I've read it 3 times. And there was a kind of a subtle up, a little rumble. And Baba seemed quite curious about that. He said, do you think, could you sum up for me in a nutshell the essence of God Speak? And it was the simplest thing. It all came together very easily. I said, yes, Baba. The whole of creation exists so that the soul can find its way back to you. Baba radiated and made a sign. Oh, I was about to say, the whole of creation exists so that soul can find its way back to God. So I just eliminated God because to me, that's who he was. And that's what he was to me. So very easily it transitioned to just set that aside and put that away because to me, he was divine himself. So he seemed very happy, thrilled. And then there was, all of a sudden, there was a kind of a hysterical person in the back who asked a question. And he said, Baba, ask him if he smoked. Baba looked at the person, and as though he were confused, he looked at me and said, it's not odd he's asking a question like that. I mean, but I have to accommodate him. So, do you smoke? Just casually like this. And I thought, well, I didn't smoke tobacco except maybe really once or twice or maybe 3 times a year. I smoked a cigarette. It was enough for me to say occasionally. And then the hysteric in the back says, Baba, ask him what he smokes. And then Baba again was like confused and almost a little annoyed. And it looked like there he goes again. What do you smoke? And I said, I smoke hemp. And the crowd went crazy. They just like hit the ceiling. And talk about obedience. All Baba did was this. And it was like you hit the sound button on the TV. Just like that. Instant silence. All Baba said, the only thing he said was, best if you don't smoke. Smoking is very bad. That was it. That's all he said. And then he began to talk. The mood became very serious. He began to talk about the urgency of focusing one's whole attention, or one's whole being, on the need and the necessity of uncovering the divine beloved within. The divine beloved resides within each one of us, but it's the most important duty or responsibility one has is to relinquish everything for the sake of that discovery. We talked about doing this so that one can actuate at the same time the beloved in one's action. And he was talking, and as he talked about this, he also began to show me that presence within. To such an extent, he began to open up, it was here, that he began to open up the reality of that experience. To such an extent that honestly I thought I was going to die from the beauty and the intensity of the energy of that, and the experience of that love. And that love just took place with absolutely everything else in my experience, in my life at that moment. And in spite of anything, I didn't think, I just heard myself calling out, oh God. And I found myself having thrown myself at his feet and put my head on his feet and took hold of his feet. Just completely out of control. And when I came to my senses and sat back again, Eric came over to me and said, you are very blessed to have been allowed to touch Baba's feet. No one has been allowed to touch Baba's feet. And I found out that not even Mandali had been allowed to touch his feet for quite some length of time. And then Baba asked all the Mandali to go out on the veranda. And I was completely alone, standing next to him. And as I stood there, this is what I was mentioning before about no words. There was nobody, no urge, nobody would say, just Baba and I. And he looked at me, and just like I'm talking to you, he said, did you enjoy smoking? I said, without even giving it a second thought, I said, yes. He said, went like this. That's interesting. And so that was my experience with him at that time. Oh, yes, I forgot. Early on, before he asked me about God's feet, the first thing he said to me was, you've broken the ice. You have no idea how blessed you are today. You've broken the ice from East West Gas.
Broken the ice from East West Gas.
Say it again now.
You have no idea how blessed you are today. You have broken the ice for the East-West gathering. So then, I think it was Francis who drove me back to my hotel. And